Okay, so now we have two new guest speakers. I'll start by introducing Mrs. Mafalda Dâmaso, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, which hosted this morning a panel on the power of culture in reimagining Europe. Am I right?
Yes.
So could you first of all very briefly tell us broadly to our audience what was discussed during this panel?
Of course, and it's also a pleasure to be here. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much for the invitation and for doing this. It's culture and knowledge. They're public goods, and the work that you're doing here shows that and is a proof of that. So thank you for spending your time doing this. So we talked about different things. So we had Isabel Schwarz, who's head of public policy at the European Cultural Foundation, and she was talking about the work that the foundation does in terms of supporting the potential of culture in strengthening belonging, a sense of social cohesion and belonging. So they do lots of work, for example, with libraries all around Europe, because libraries are in fact community spaces as well, and they're spaces of encounter. We also had Pavel Zerka from the European Council on Foreign Relations, who has done work on cultural wars, and he actually wrote a really interesting report that looked at how the Americans, how Trump 2.0 is engaging in those cultural wars, and so he talked about that and how Europe should respond to that. Then we had Aurora Ham, who's a PhD researcher here in the history department, who talked about the ways cultural references, European cultural references, are used, manipulated by illiberal actors, and the need to actually engage with those conversations and to rethink what European culture and identity is, and they are, because if not, some other actors will do it. And then I talked about the potential of culture to be a bridge builder, and how we can get in museums, in cultural organizations, people that have different views around a table, and we can get them to talk, and in this very polarized world that is much needed. So we talked about the contribution of culture to these complex problems like belonging, like the sense of identity, cultural wars, polarization. So I think it was a very rich conversation, but I'm biased though.
Maybe it's time to jump right on the spot and ask about Chiara what maybe she thinks about that topic, because I understand that you were in a panel, you're an expected guest, you were in a panel that talks about universities, and you did something related to culture, am I correct?
Yes, you are correct. So I was in a panel in which we discussed the future of universities. I was a part of this seminar at the EUI called the University of Nowhere. And the point of the seminar was first to read very broadly about what education in the future could look like and about utopian possibilities. And then a second part of the seminar consisted in a creative writing project in which, together with researchers, postdoc, and a few professors such as Lorraine Lecausanet and Ben Carver from the Language Center, we imagined what this university of the future could be like. And specifically, we took inspiration from William Morris's piece, News from Nowhere, in which this British socialist writer and designer actually imagined a utopian place called Nowhere, which looks like Britain but also is really different in some other respects. And so the university was then called after this place. And yes, I am sorry, I missed part of your comment before. I understand that it was on the culture wars. One thing that we were discussing, this is not about culture specifically, but maybe I can talk a bit about conflict in a sense and how we dealt with conflict in this seminar and in the University of Nowhere. Actually, we had a discussion about how much utopia should be ideal or should still show cracks, should show disagreement, people that maybe indeed manipulate certain references or try to have their way at this university. So in the way we did the way we solved that was to very strangely and creatively imagine that the university is actually crisscrossed by a series of tunnels that run under it, and people who are kind of seditious or who don't agree with some things can take refuge in those tunnels and maybe even dig further, like connect the university to the town. So I think one thing that we learned through this seminar is that Utopia always includes conflict and always includes other issues, and that the way to portray them in writing, but also maybe in how we think about them, is not to totally exclude their possibility, but try to see them as a constituent part of what a university is like.
Yes, thank you very much, Chiara, for your reply back to Mafalda's feedback. But in the meanwhile, Professor Anton Hemerijck at the Social and Political Science of the European University Institute has joined us. Welcome, Anton. It's good to see you.
And to be here.
You were the other half, together with Giancarlo Corsetti, who has just been here, of the panel dedicated to European social model. And I'm inspired by the utopia that Chiara has just mentioned. Is social model still real, or on Utopia we had some tweaks, some hints from Giancarlo, but Giancarlo we all know is an economist, you are a social scientist, so what is your take and what did you learn from this panel today?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I think we had a really good panel, very much forward-looking on many issues having to do with culture wars, actually, but also about aging, climate change, and how social policy could be sort of an important lever to improve the human condition in Europe. Now, on the Utopia side, I mean, the thing is, in Europe, we have pretty well-established welfare states. So the social I have to go close. So the social commitments in Europe are relatively strong. They're not. I mean, they're not always sort of functional. So you know, more in the north than in the south. But that's a side point. So in other words, this was a utopia, let's say in the 1930s, that was implemented in the 1940s and 50s. And the way it's been with us for such a long time gives it also quite a bit of resilience. You know, we have in Europe, we have quasi-free education up to university. Everybody's guaranteed a basic pension when we grow old, and you know, if we're in the labor market and we are hit by something, you know, there's healthcare and there is unemployment benefits. So these things are really precious. So this is a utopia that has been put into practice, and it's very difficult to get away from. So there is already a way. So the will is about, you know, what comes next, and that's what we discussed.
If I may, I have a follow-up question for you, Anton. We discussed before with Josephine Van Zelden the relationship between academia and policymaking, and there you bring some experience, right? So how did you manage this relationship between your work as a scholars and then trying to convince policymakers to do the right things in relation to what you put on paper as an evidence?
Okay, the way I think about sort of, you know, the interaction between us as academics and policymakers, and this is not to be arrogant, but basically what we can do for policymakers is to widen the repertoire of choice. Because policymakers are always obsessed, you know, what should I do now, tomorrow, given, you know, Trump is there, but, you know, maybe in half a year he's not so powerful anymore, we don't know. And that sort of pushes policymakers into quick fixes. So what I think we at EUI should do, particularly on days like this, is to widen the repertoire of choice. You know, there are more roads to Rome than you can imagine, and this is something that I think we are good at. And if we can sort of supply also, you know, evidence to these roads that, you know, one way is a little bit more quicker or easier to travel than others, but others are worthwhile, but, you know, you have to face hurdles. That's also a contribution that we as academics can make.
Thank you very much, Anton. And this reminds me of fantastic hiking we did together a few years ago, because you mentioned roads and pathways. I would like to quickly go to Mafalda. Exactly about the wide of repertoire of choices. I'm quoting Anton. How we can use that in culture, because you mentioned there can be cultural wars, culture can divide. But here I'm interested to look at what, on the contrary, brings us together. I love fairy tales. And again, sorry for the ad, I have a radio show here on fairy tales and storytelling. And I noticed that Cinderella is the same across countries, and there are more than 300 versions. So on this fairy tales note, could you give us some hints to navigating these different pathways?
Of course. I mean, I'll give an example that I actually mentioned during the panel of an article that I published last year. And it was based on a piece that I read at The Guardian, where the journalist had interviewed the director of a museum in Germany, Wilke Wagner, and she's the director of a museum in Dresden, in Eastern Germany. And she was the target, long story short, of a far-right campaign. Organic to some extent, but also partially, one can say, orchestrated by a tabloid, as a result of her decision and the museum's decision to showcase in the public sphere a sculpture by a, now I don't remember if it's a Syrian artist, I might be wrong, but it was not a German artist. And she was the target of a hate campaign. She received hundreds of emails, calls, and she was quite depressed, of course, and shocked, and did not act for a while. And then she decided, and this takes a very special kind of person, which would not be me. I don't think I would have that in me. But she decided at a certain point, after a few weeks of being extremely depressed, of actually calling back and those who had left their phone numbers and those emails. And so she called them back. And she said that actually, of course, there were some people with whom it was completely impossible to have a conversation. They just wanted to shout. But others actually had interesting points to make about the museum. So that the museum that she directs is a modern and contemporary art museum. And it's true, she recognizes that some of these people, when they said that they would like to see more art from Germany's past, it's true that the museum did not engage with that conversation. The museum was mostly focused on the present and on contemporary artists that is future-oriented. And so she decided, with her team, to invite those people into the museum. And she created a set of sessions called We Must Talk. Of course, there were clear guidelines in terms of how much time each person could say. There were things that could not be said, hate speech, etc. All of that was not present. But there was an attempt, and I think it was a productive attempt, as a scholar I can say that, to invite those people in, hear what they had to say, but then establish a bridge that is a bridge between some of the claims and the demands of these individuals who are part of the local community, and then the interests, the values, the claims of other individuals who are perhaps more progressive, who are also part of the community. And so, to give a specific example, she heard a lot that there would be a need or the desire for more German art from the past. And of course, the undertone of this was that there would be men, white men, that would be shown, right, as part of this understanding of the past. Nothing against it, but this was the assumption. And what she decided to do with her art historian fellows was to say, okay, let's think about what the past of Germany is, but let's also do it in ways that actually expand the canon of history of art, which is what the role of a museum is. So they showcase women dissidents, female artists, women artists who are dissidents and who were actually doing really interesting work in that period. So all of this to say, culture can be a bridge builder, and it can help us, it can create space for other narratives around our past, shared narratives. Because of course the result of those conversations was a set of exhibitions, and these exhibitions are relevant to different kinds of communities, right? That community that wants to see more about the past, and the community that actually want to hear different stories that expand the canon of new artists. And so it's not a traditional fairy tale to say that a museum can invite actors who are perhaps very hateful and in their original or first engagement with someone. But I think that it's a story that talks about the power of and the need for us to rethink what Europe is, what Germany is, what culture is, and to tell new stories. So I'm not sure if we need new fairy tales. I do think we need new stories and new narratives. But yeah, so that would be my answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mafalda.
It was a pleasure. I think we're moving on to the next panel, but it was a great pleasure to have you on our show.